What we're going to talk about today, I almost got into that prematurely, excuse me. First things first, in order to understand combustion safety testing, you have to understand how a gauge works. Now, this is my first question to you. While I go through some of these points, some of these session objectives, let me know how do you feel about your level of savvy? How many tests or have you done? Or how about this? Let me ask you this. On a scale of 1 to 10, please let me know through your question panel how savvy or how familiar you are with how a gauge actually works or what it does, how it works internally. And I'll let that direct me as I go through my slides about gauge fundamentals, because you have to understand how the gauge works in order to understand how to do combustion safety testing. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about adapting to BPI standards. So the standards have changed significantly, especially in terms of combustion safety, and in my opinion, for the better. I'm going to do a little kind of compare and contrast with the RESNET testing requirements or the ACA testing requirements if you're a RESNET rater. Second question, and then we'll kind of run over NFP as well. So it looks like a lot of folks are right there in the mid-range as far as your savvy level of 1 to 10. Looks like we're getting a lot of 6s to 8s. So next question, which one of these standards do you think is most important to you or most interesting to you? The BPI, RESNET, or NFPA? Please answer one of the three using your question panel. And again, I will use that to guide my discussion today. So significantly, I've only got about 2 RESNETs, so that's good. So I will definitely I'll definitely customize my presentation here so that we get a little bit more into the BPI. And then we're going to talk about best practices for best results. Best practices, if you don't know, are not necessarily a specific protocol or a specific process, but they're sort of the better way to do things from people who have done it in the field, and it's basically an opinion. But I offer these opinions to you in hopes that they help you with your CAZ testing to make it a little bit more valid, a little bit more efficient. And then let's talk about how you can just stop running up and down the stairs. And so I want to leave that one a mystery. All right, thanks for your input. Let's get started. So why do we CAZ test? Really quickly, for those of you who aren't, you know what, I want to back up. So while you kind of read this slide, and I think it's pretty obvious, I want to talk about what we're not going to talk about today. So first things first, I want to apologize for those of you who aren't in the United States or North America in general. This is going to be a webinar that is very much focused on not only our housing stock here in North America, but also our codes and standards that are specific to us. So hopefully if you've tuned in late night in Europe or even really early in the morning in Asia, hopefully if you still want to stick with us, you'll find this to be interesting, even though it's not specifically for you. The other thing that I want to make sure that you understand, and please make sure that you understand, is that I am not a BPI, RESNET, or NFPA representative. I do represent Retrotec, although I am a private consultant. So what that means is, if you have specific questions or specific complaints, especially about some of the standards that we're going to be reviewing, I cannot answer those for you. I cannot speak to them for you. What's more, I'm going to try to stay away from my personal opinions or views on some of these standards, because I'm sure that's not why you dialed in. So please, as we go forward, keep in mind if you have specific questions about some of these standards, I cannot answer them for you. I would direct you to please go to BPI, RESNET, NFPA, or anybody else specifically with those questions, because I just cannot fulfill them for you. So I think I've made that specific. So real easily. Obviously, CAZ testing, combustion appliance zone testing, or we'll just call it CAZ testing from here on out, is really the first and foremost about health and safety, but it's also about building integrity because there's moisture involved, there's heat involved, things can break down, things can be destroyed. It's also about comfort. Why is it about comfort? Well, this can obviously affect the way that you breathe, the way that you feel in your house. And then it is about energy efficiency because obviously the tighter that you make the house, the more this actually can become a problem. All right, so let's move on. So let's talk about, again, another thing that's maybe another fundamental, but I want to get this out. So complete combustion, what is complete combustion? So when you actually burn or when you actually heat, when we're using fossil fuels, or even, and I think we're going to talk more about fossil fuels. In the past, we used to talk about solid fuels, but then that also included woods, which I think are kind of an exception to the rule when we're talking about wood-burning stoves. And all my friends from the, especially upstate Western New York, can I get a amen? So we're going to talk a lot about fossil fuels. So basically, that fossil fuel mixed with oxygen and heat come together to make combustion, and the byproducts, the natural byproducts, are water vapor and carbon dioxide and heat. So we will get a tiny amount of excess air, and ideally, if this is perfect combustion, which never happens, but the better the combustion, the less that we'll get of carbon monoxide. So I don't know that we're going to have really time to get into deciding what the problems are or solutions for the problems that are caused by incomplete combustion or by possibility of having carbon monoxide in that air that might be spilling or backdrafting into the house. But if we don't have time, suffice it to say that just because you have spillage or just because you have backdrafting doesn't necessarily mean that you have carbon monoxide, but it could. And either way, it's definitely something that we want to avoid. Amen, Maria. So let's get into the gauge fundamentals. And it looks like most of you are somewhat familiar with it, so I want to kind of go through this a little bit faster. And you know what? I want to say hello to say Kelly and Matt. Thanks for saying hi. Thanks for stopping by. So what's in a gauge? Well, a gauge is basically a manometer, and it's got two manometers in it, and that goes for your DG700 from the Energy Conservatory, your DM2, or your DM32 from Retrotec. But what do they do? Well, they measure the pressure differences between two locations, and I always feel like I have to make sure that people understand that when they look at the gauge, they are not seeing absolute pressure. They are seeing the difference between 2 points, and that is so important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the setup, setting up the house for a test, setting up the gauge for the test, and where the tubing goes. But let's not lose sight of the fact that even though it does not use absolute pressures, they still are important. So what are absolute pressures? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because absolute pressures will actually come into play during our setup. So what are some absolute pressures? Length, temperature. That's so essentially if you are 2 meters tall for anybody outside of the United States or 6'6" for the rest of us, it doesn't make any difference where you are or what size house you're in, you're still 6'6". However, if you're looking at a gauge, the difference between 2 points here showed in this manometer being pressure here is making the water move up here, and now we have the difference between these two. So again, this guy who is 2 meters tall, 6'6", if he's in a big house, he's 6'6". If he's in a small house, he's 6'6". However, if I'm using a differential gauge, and let's say the difference between a larger house and a smaller house, well, that measurement will be different. So didn't think enough about that analogy before I broke it out. But the point is that here you might have a man who's 6'6". Here I have the difference between 2 points being 1, 2, 3, 4. So the pressure here that I'm seeing in inches and water column is not 2, it's actually 4 because it's the difference between 2 points. All right. So yes, Lee, I will try and set you up as administrator. In the meantime, help me out. So I want to talk a little bit about my man Pascal. Blaise Pascal. So I believe, does anybody out there have a dog named Pascal or Blaise? I can't remember, Kelly, if that's you or if that's a friend of ours, but I know somebody who's got a dog, but that's not, this is a different guy. Pascal is the guy. So when we talk, that made up, or that came up with this sort of idea of a pressure, a universal unit for pressure. So it is an international system, part of the international systems of units. It's the Pascal. So the Pascal gets its name from, of course, the French scientist Blaise Pascal, and it's abbreviated PA. It's equivalent to basically 1 Newton of force applied over 1 square meter, or basically about the weight of 1 sticky note, or as my friend Chris Dorsey likes to say, about 10 gnat farts. So it's a very, 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 very small amount of pressure. And that's really important when we talk about how we test and why it's important to pay so much attention to the details as we go through it. So I want to talk about, give you an idea a little bit about what we're talking about when we are talking about, of course, differential pressure. So in a differential pressure, you're always going to have a reference and your input. The input will always give you information with reference to something. That reference will always be 0 when we're talking in numbers. So regardless of whether you're using pascals of pressure, if you're using inches of water column, inches of mercury, or even say inches of pressure, pressure across a certain area, it doesn't make any difference. It's always going to be 0. So what happens if we have a tree that's larger than the reference source by 2 times? So this tree with reference to this source is +2. We're going to give that tree a number. And then the smaller tree, that's about half the size. So now the number that we assign to that one with reference to its source, to the middle one, is -0.5 because it's half the size. Make sense? So what if we change the reference now? What if we change that reference from this tree, the one in the middle, to the smaller tree? Now that smaller tree, which before was -5, becomes 0. And the tree that's in the middle is now twice its size. That one that was before was 0, now becomes +2. So what do you think the larger one is? If you guessed +4, you were right. And I'm sure you did, because it sounds like everybody knows what we're talking about here. So they're all positive numbers because they're all on the positive side. They're all larger. If they were on the negative side, let's say if we changed the tree, the largest tree or the reference tree to 0, being the larger tree to the reference of 0, now, as you see, this is the tree in the middle, that's half its size, now becomes a negative reference. So you see how this applies to the pressure gauge, why that's important. So if we're just using a pressure gauge, and this is just sort of a generic looking gauge where we have an input and a reference, the fact that our reference could be positive on the outside, or that we could have a huge pressure on the outside, could make the pressures on the inside seem negative with reference to the outside, even though it might not be a negative pressure, a negative absolute pressure, or vice versa. If it's a negative pressure on the outside, the pressures on the inside could still be negative, but less negative with reference to the outside, and appear positive. Make sense? So the question is, what's a better reading, Pascal or inches per water column? It depends on where you're at or what you're using the results for, Neil, but I like to talk in Pascals because I think that's the universal language. However, if you are a HVAC contractor, you might want to stick with inches of water column. In this respect, for CAZ testing, all of the codes discuss or talk about, or that I'm familiar with, talk about Pascals. So here again, now we have a gauge, and now you can see that when we reference the input is the smaller tree with reference to the larger tree, we now have a negative outcome. We switch those up, and we reference the smaller tree to the larger tree, and now we have a positive outcome. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So it looks like we are not losing people, so that must mean my pace is pretty good. If you have any suggestions for my pace or any problems with anything that I'm discussing, please let me know. So I want to get into this. So next question. Which gauge do you use or are you familiar with? Is it the DM32, the DM2, which is in here, or the DG700? And you can say both. So I'm going to give you a second to answer. From what I'm seeing on my end, we really have a lot of people who are very familiar with the DG700. So that's good, because this is what I want to explain this to you before we go any further, because of course this is a Retrotec webinar, so I'm going to be talking mostly about things from a Retrotec perspective. So I want to make sure that you can easily draw an analogy between our two gauges. So the two gauges are similar in many ways. They both have two channels. So with the Retrotec gauge, you'll notice that the channels are more obvious, or the inputs for the channels, the bulkheads, inputs and reference, where you connect your tubing, are on the top. And here on the left side, you have channel A, similar to the DG700. We have an input and a reference. That's their channel A on the left. And here you can see on the screen that anything that goes through this channel on the left side shows up on the left side of their screen, and that's channel A again. With Retrotec, anything that, or the DM32, anything that is plugged into this input and reference on channel A on the left side of the top shows up on the top of the gauge. So this is a minor difference, but can be important for you to understand what we're going to be talking about. That channel A and channel B are on top of one another on the DM32, where on the DM32 they're on the left and right. Okay, makes sense, everybody? And then channel B. So channel B, again, is essentially both of these channels, I should back up a little bit, are their own discrete, mutually exclusive manometers. So telling you the difference between these 2 points, the input and the reference, and on channel A, and then on channel B, the difference between these 2 points, which is a reference and an input, and here we have an input and a reference. So pretty easy. So with reference to, I shouldn't say with reference to when we're talking about gauges, should I? When we talk about combustion safety testing, we're probably going to be talking mostly about channel A, right? And I'm sure that's your experience with the DG700. Okay, so let's talk about the difference, ladies and gentlemen, the difference between your RESNET or ACA QH12, which is actually the reference which is actually the testing procedure that is referenced in the RESNET code, versus BPI 1200, which is the new one. Oh yeah, and NFPA. So when I asked earlier, and you know, really obviously none of these guys are exactly at odds. The thing is, I like this picture because I think it's hilarious. And I love the fact that, you know, that basically they've got, I don't even know whose side are the helicopters on. Anybody have any idea? Little joke there, but the point is that that there are very, very minor differences between all three of these codes, which I think are the three main testing standards that we deal with in home performance. But I want to go over this. So quickly, here's some changes that have happened recently. Now I want to let you know that I believe, as far as the RESNET standard, the ACA QH12 standard that reference or that RESNET references, I am pretty sure that these are the standards. They've changed to the best of my knowledge. Again, I am not an expert in this, but it's important for me to let you know that that I know that there's been many changes and many retractions recently. So I think that this is the most up to date. And I got this information from my friend Paul Francisco, who presented this information and was part of a study that was sort of looking more deeply at combustion safety testing that he presented at NASCAP. Did anybody see this? And Neil says the helicopters are auditors. You got that right. So anyway, the point is that it's been recently revised, and I do think that this is that we're going to be talking about the most up-to-date versions. It also references other standards, so it actually does mention in the RESNET, in the RESNET in the code, which I believe is page 341. Somebody help me with that. I think it does mention that. It does mention BPI. It mentions NFPA, and it does mention the ACA one. It does include the ACA QH12 does include a specific test procedure. It does not account for the impact of the air handler, but the bottom line is, and I'll explain this more clearly in a minute, but it does call for spillage limit of about 5 minutes, and we're going to find that that's pretty common across most of these. So the one that you wanted to talk about the most from your response there was this one. That's the BPI 1200. So it was recently revised. Big deal here is that it no longer contains CAZ depressurization limit. Who is familiar? Please let me know. Say basically, this is a yes or no question. Are you familiar? Are you more familiar? I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it. Are you familiar with the combustion safety testing for BPI before BPI 1200? Yes, it's out there. And a nice we, thank you. Before 1200. All right, a resounding, a great deal of people out there. Thank you so much. Yes. So what's happened now is, remember that we used to do, what we used to do is we used to find out what the worst case depressurization, Mo, back to you, we're talking about worst case depressurization. So we'd find the worst case depressurization, and we'd actually get the number, find out what that number is, and then we would apply it to a list, an action level list. And if that combustion worst case depressurization number was beyond that list, then we would have to take some kind of action. We no longer do that. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But that's, in my opinion, I think that's great. I think that's really great. Yes, this does, the BPI 1200 standard does include a test procedure. And again, there is a 5-minute spillage limit for a cold vent. And then, it looks like I lost one of my, and then I guess I had one bullet point that was animated. Sorry about that. But there's a 2-minute spillage limit for a warm vent. So that's, I think, that is a major difference between the BPI standard and any other standards that I'm familiar with. So very quickly, I'll just run past NFPA. When I asked what you're interested in, I didn't get too many people saying that they're interested in this. But just to let you know, the NFPA 54, there is actually the National Fuel Gas Code does have a procedure, and it includes optional guidances. It basically says you can do this, or you can do some other stuff. It includes some existing buildings for the first time. Before it was just new buildings. It now does consider the impact of the air handler operation, and once again, just like so many of the other ones, it takes into consideration it gives you 5 minutes of spillage limitation. So I want to talk a little bit about the changes that have happened now. So many of you said that you were familiar with the BPI testing in 1200 before, the CAZ testing before BPI 1200. So I want to talk about some of the changes. And again, all of my information is given, give this to you as a person who is not a BPI proctor, who is not even certified by BPI, but I'm familiar with this because of my experience in the field, and I want to tell you about it. So, and then sounds like you wanted to hear about it. So you no longer check every door. So it used to be that we would use a gauge, or we would use a smokestack stick to check every single door to see if it's negative or positive. We no longer do that. Basically what we do is we open up any door with a return or an exhaust, and then we turn on all exhausts and dryers. Oh, and I should say that any doors are either open or closed, right? So doors that are not open, or doors that don't, rooms that do not have a return or an exhaust in them, those doors are closed. So okay, it makes sense. Obviously, I think that's pretty should be pretty clear. So turn on all exhausts and the dryer. except for the hair dryer. Hair dryer does not need to be turned on. That's actually true, but I said it in a facetious and I hope humorous way. And ceiling fans. Ceiling fans will actually not make a difference. Oftentimes, I do turn those off just as a way of doing it, just in case it causes any turbulence across my pickups. But yes, so hair dryers off, ceiling fans off or on. So with or without an air handler. So what we're doing here is we're going to test with the air handler on and with the air handler off. Simple as that. So we'll see the difference, and we'll take a look at our gauge to see if there's any change. Additionally, we'll check what the gauge or what the pressure in the combustion safety zone is with the door open and with the door closed, and that's the door to the combustion safety zone. And sometimes if you have a heating, or if you have those appliances in an open room, it might just be a door to, say, the basement or to an actual furnace closet. Make sense? So this again is given to me, or I guess I learned this from Paul Francisco, who, by the way, Paul, if you're out there, I'm so glad to see that you've got something else to talk about besides ASHRAE 62.2. And not that I don't love you and love the ASHRAE 62.2, but it's got to be a breath of fresh air to talk about, and I do mean fresh air. That's a joke. To talk about this. So he says that, and this is kind of a background insight, he said that when they convened meetings and they brought in so many people, they brought in experts that from the field, they brought in individuals that were doing research, and they brought in lots of people who have been trainers and experts in all kinds of things, and especially with experience in combustion safety testing. And they found out that backdrafting requires a much greater depressurization than spillage. So they figured that spillage should happen first. Makes sense, right? So point is, and let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Many people get confused with what a backdraft is and what spillage is. It's pretty easy. Backdrafting means that you have this flue gas that is actually going up the flue, and it's entering the flue, and it's actually moving up the flue until a depressurization, until a force of pressure, usually depressurization, almost always, actually sucks or pulls that pressure out of the flue pipe and back in, hence the term backdraft. So it was drafting forward, now you've caused it to backdraft. All right, versus spillage. Spillage, the word spillage actually means that it doesn't even really make it all the way into the flue pipe. And I used to have a problem with this when I was first learning about it. I couldn't understand how some of the flue, or some of that air or some of that flue gas could get into or begin to draft, but meanwhile it could actually spill out. And that's important to know too, because what we're no longer doing in this BPI 1200, we're no longer testing draft. Why? Because, well, why did we in the first place, really is, and again, that's my opinion. But as I explained, this stuff, you could have flue gas that is coming out of an appliance, and a portion of that flue gas is spilling into the room and possibly moving through the house. But the flue gas that is getting into the flue pipe is drafting beautifully. But it doesn't matter. So that's another thing that they said. They said we're no longer going to test draft, because homes that failed draft anyway failed the spillage as well. So really, they found that there was really no correlation between spillage and draft that necessitated an additional test. So they no longer do draft testing. And then, like as I mentioned before, there is no longer a minimum, not only a minimum draft, but there's no longer a minimum, there was no longer a observance of a limit to worst case depressurization or an action limit. So there is a question here asking specifically. So Matt is asking specifically about this slide. So Matt, I'm glad you asked. So Matt says, if I'm not mistaken, the 5-minute spillage for cold vent says except for domestic water heater, or DWH. The domestic water heater follows the 2-minute spillage mark. That's how I read it. And essentially, Matthew, I'm sorry, that's right. So the idea is that 2 minutes for water heaters and furnaces in heating mode. So generally, this is probably going to end up being a source of debate among trainers and testers, but the point was that domestic water heaters are almost always running and almost always creating heat, since they basically are heating constantly, which we all know is the reason why we oftentimes criticize them for not being energy efficient. But the point is that the heat, those are normally warm constantly. So that's a 2 minutes. So we only give that 2 minutes for spillage because the actual flue pipe is already lubricated, and that air or that flue, that draft, that stuff should be flowing out of there quite quickly. Or furnaces in heating mode. And then 5 minutes for furnaces that are not heating mode. So the question is, no more drilling into the flue and checking if the flue is more negative than the CAZ, correct? That is correct, Andre. So I know earlier I said that I can't give you too many specifics or detailed answers, but what I can tell you is that that is a pretty general question. Yes, there is no more draft testing. There are no more draft limitations. We're not concerned with that. You're welcome. So what we're really looking at more than anything is setting up the house into a worst case depressurization scenario for the combustion zone, and then testing for spillage. So what does happen, what we do get additionally in the BPI 1200 standards, which we will not discuss, are two things. One is a discussion of carbon monoxide, and I think I alluded to that earlier, but we're not going to talk about carbon monoxide in this webinar. We don't really, I haven't set time aside, and since we're talking about, again, this is a Retrotec webinar talking about how to use pressure gauges to test for combustion safety. We are only really going to focus on pressure, and that's pressure in the CAZ. The other thing that it does talk about is our solutions, or ways to determine what's wrong based on, or what's going wrong in the house, and how you can sort of find or delineate the problems so that you can try and fix them. That's also outlined in the BPI 1200 standard, or at least alluded to, but we're not going to talk about that. So it says here that there are a lot of weatherization assessors on this webinar, and I believe BPI 1200 has not been adopted by WAP yet. So can you clarify if DOE/WAP has adopted these? Wow. No, I don't think they have. I talked to Anthony Cox yesterday, and please help me out, Kelly, if you can. But it looks like the SWS that the SWS standard work specifications are pretty close to adopting that 1200. That's according to some people that I know, and some background information. So I'm going to take another question, the 36-minute mark. And yeah, so I'm sorry, Kelly, you were not kidding. Kelly says that it's actually up to the states to determine their standards. Thank you so much, Kelly. But yes, the SWS is the red line version is aligned with 1200, and that means that I think that means that they haven't yet added that to the standard work specifications, but again, it's always up to for the Weatherization Assistance Program. That's what WAP means for those of you who don't know. It's always up to the state to decide how they want to do it. All right, I'm going to take a big question here. I'm just going to read it right out, and then we're going to move on, if that's okay with everybody. So Matthew says, you might be covering this, but the new BPI 1200 applies to building, analyst, and envelope. But the HEP certs, like QC, require the use of the old PA standards with depressurization limits in draft. He says, I know that you can't speak to it, but it's confusing as to why they kept that standard. So if you're a QCI inspector, you're required to use limits and test draft, I guess. But bringing this, he says that he's bringing this up just because someone asked about not doing draft anymore. Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because obviously we want this webinar to be useful in the present and in the future for everybody who's paying attention. So again, I don't want to confuse you about these BPI 1200 changes, because you need to find out from your trainer, your monitor, the place, whoever your provider, if it's RESNET, but you need to find out for sure that you're doing the test the correct way, using the correct methodology, process, and protocol according to where you work. So I'm going to move on past that. Thank you guys so much. Oh, so it says that the state has implemented the SWS. Can we amend the standard for state to align with no draft testing? So again, that's going to be up to you. So I'm going to move on. You know, if you're interested in these sort of things, at the first Tuesday of every month, there is a Weatherization Trainers Consortium meeting. It is a webinar, and it's been going on for many years now. It's very well run, and it's very informative, and that's definitely a very good place to get your questions answered. So I'm going to move on. But what's in really, I don't know how many standards, I guess this is in some standards, but this is sort of basic idea stuff. That before you get started, before we get into a process and protocol, steps of service sort of thing, let's just talk about visual inspection. So you want to make sure that you take a look at this stuff before you set up any materials. In fact, my personal opinion, my best practices that I used to use when I was doing weatherization audits is I would not unpack any of my materials until I actually walked through the house. And this is generally the first place I walked to. Because if you can walk into a house and see that if you're, say, for instance, following an NFPA 54 code, or if you have specific standards that are set about the way that the pitch of event, say our state in Illinois used to have a specific protocol for the pitch of event. You want to make sure that it's pitched that way. And if it can't be pitched or if it can't be fixed, you might want to walk away, defer this job, or you might want to talk to the homeowner and say, hey, before I get started, I need you to fix these things because I cannot ensure your safety. And again, that's up to you. All right. So Laura, I won't read that aloud. Again, here's another sign. So we want to look at these sort of simple things that are taken for granted. And obviously, these are existing buildings. But you know what? Sometimes this type of stuff happens in new buildings. I know plenty of RESNET raters who find stuff that just forgot. Guys just forgot to, they put a cap on, or forgot to attach a part, or were, the old joke about this was a Friday afternoon job where they forgot to pull back the tabs. But you got to look for these basic things. These connections, these flue gas failures can be pretty obvious. And then little things like this, where, this must be open, do not block, they blocked it. Here we have, again, this is a Cisco. Thank you so much for at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center and IECC accredited, certified training center for the WAP program. And there's a picture from a weatherization where this is a relief pipe coming from the outside. Probably got cold in here, so somebody had stuffed a blanket in it and then closed it off. So they were not getting relief here, and you can see there's some elevated levels of deterioration on some of the oxidation on some of these appliances, and looks like the auditor dropped her lipstick as well. So let's talk a little bit more about best practices, shall we? Okay. So, oh, and it looks like I've got quite a few questions here about that weekly webinar. So it is a monthly webinar, the first Tuesday of every month. It is a trainers consortium meeting. It's a WAP meeting, and it's generally pointed towards trainers, but it is definitely not exclusive to trainers. It's for anybody who's interested. And you can, if you like all about this, you can send me an email. I am J West, just the letter J, West, like the direction, no period, nothing, at retrotec.com. Send me an email. I will forward it to Kelly Cutchin, and she'll get you on the list as long as you want. So I hope I'm not speaking for you, Kelly. So let's talk about best practices. So we're talking about combustion safety testing, but this is a guy putting in a blower door. And this is a list of setup for a blower door. But guess what? This list of setup is pretty much the same house setup for a combustion safety test. So what I recommend, first best practice that I want to recommend to all of you is that if you're doing a combustion safety test and you're doing a blower door test, then you want to make sure, or I'm sorry, you don't want to make sure, but it's probably a good idea just to set them up all at once. In fact, one of the things that I used to like to do is actually set up the blower door, set up my reference tube, get everything perfect, and then when I want to, it's just a matter of changing a couple of tubes between the two tests. So it's very simple, and it saves a lot of time. In fact, when I was in the field training this quite a bit, I used to get the response, "Oh, great! Now I have to do another test. No, if I'm going to have to do that, that's going to take. Now I got to break this down and take this stuff apart and everything like that." But no, this one basically is pretty simple. It's almost the exact same setup. So Neil says, "Do you do duct blasting?" Do I? Absolutely. I mean, I work for a blower door company that makes duct testers. Yeah, you made me say it, Neil. Good job. But that test setup is different. So yeah, that's going to be with reference to the outside, but with the house open. So I do not want you to get confused. Please, people, don't get confused. But the house setup for the blower door is the same, or at least the shell of the house is the same as the house setup, the initial setup for the blower door as for the CAZ, but not the duct tester. That's different. Okay. So first thing I want to recommend to you to save time, set up the blower door and the duct test at the same time. So the next thing I want to recommend to you is where to set it up. And this again is a best practice. So I'm going to take this basic picture here, and I'm going to say that here we have our combustion appliance zone. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, you want to set up the blower door. So this was recommended to me by my guru, Keith Williams in Wisconsin, who said, well, if you're going to set up the blower door and the duct test at the same time, then maybe you should set up the blower door closest to the combustion safety zone, or to the combustion appliance zone, sorry. And that's a really good idea. One, because it saves on the amount of tube that you have to run, but two, if you have, say, the homeowner or the contractor or somebody standing right here by this front door and you set the fan up, it's going to get excessively hot or cold depending on the temperature outside, and it's going to be excessively loud, as well as the fact that if somebody has to leave immediately, the door is blocked. I think we've all been through that. So let's imagine that this is where the back door is. So what if we set our fan up here? We set up our reference tube to the outside right here, and then we set up our gauge right here. And now let me see if I can get a different color. Okay, great. So I'm going to use my reference hose. We're going to reference red to blue because it's on the left, the A channel, right? So I'm now going to take a blue tube and run it to about 2 feet away from my combustion appliance zone. So now what I've done here is I have set up my fan in an area right here where it's out of the way. I've got my reference to outside already set up for both my blower door and my duct test. And now the only thing that I had to do for setting up at least the initial setup for the house and the tubing was to sort of plug in this tube. So what I would normally do is, depending on which test I did first, I would run my tube but then not plug it in. But I would run the tube here, get it all set up, and get ready to go. Now, a word about questions earlier about whether that flue is cold or warm. Oftentimes what I used to do when I was using the old standards and when I was using the Illinois weatherization standards, which were, as Kelly pointed out, were different for the state that I'm in, I'm from Chicago, than they were for other states, we used to ask that if it was a cold day, that I would actually depressurize just a little bit to cool off the flue, or because the furnace was probably running and the flue pipe was probably warm. So I would actually depressurize for a few minutes, and after I turned off the appliance, and then I would suck some of that cold air out and then kind of cool it off. So you might want to do that as well. It's up to you. Or if it's a warm day, you might want to actually, and the building is cooled, you might actually want to pressurize and blow some of that cool air through there. Again, best practices, not something you necessarily have to do. So next, I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is the reference hose. So remember, I was really emphasizing when we were talking about gauge fundamentals, we were talking about how important it is then to understand that what you're seeing is the difference between the reference and the input, right? And we just talked about where our reference and our inputs or tubing will be, right? So we also talked about how small a pascal is, how little, what the small amount of air or small amount of pressure pascal is. So especially if you are still using a test process that still uses a combustion depressurization limit. You had noted some of the QCI folks, or even, I believe, RESNET, even NFPA, some of those, or older ones especially, still point to a limit of depressurization for that combustion safety zone, and oftentimes that limit is right around 5 to, say, 10 pascals. That is such a small amount of pressure. So in the inch of water column, if you take a straw and you just pull just an inch of liquid into that straw, that's almost 250 pascals. So these little bitty pressures are it's very, very sensitive. So it's so important that you make sure that your reference hose is safe and that it's not getting these wind-driven effects off of it. So what I like to do, and this is my opinion, and is I like to use this guy right here. I made this out of a little bitty tube. Actually, my friend Pete Kutcher made this, and it's a genius idea. But the idea is, here inside of it, we have just a tennis ball. This tennis ball has been perforated. I have a bit of pressure tube that's in there with what we call a bulkhead or a pressure tap sticking out of it, and I've perforated it and filled it with a bunch of rocks, larger rocks, not small rocks, because small rocks will get into the tube and mess it up. And then what we've done at this idea, again, coming from Pete here at CETA Weatherization, Pete Kushner, but he said, why don't you just stick this into a box of rocks? This is a very loose top, and then put the top on there, and then you can connect your reference hose, and the reference hose will not be subject to sort of wind-driven or those sort of weather events from the outside. Right? So here we're talking again about making sure that we are being fastidious about protecting or about making sure that our differential pressure is right. However, I've also heard from people saying, well, yeah, but that's the problem is that you're only referencing the pressure inside here with reference to the combustion zone, or you're referencing the inside of this thing. That's where I wanted to bring up the idea of absolute pressure. Again, this is my opinion. This is not the opinion of Retrotec, and you'll notice that this is definitely not a Retrotec piece of equipment. This is a best practice that I've developed with some other people, and it's definitely highly debated. But again, I say that the amount of absolute pressure, or that sort of pressure that comes from being at the bottom of the atmosphere of the Earth, you know, essentially at the bottom of an ocean of air, it's a tremendous amount of pressure. Does anybody out there know how many inches of water column or how many pascals were of pressure are actually, you know, part of the that we're under here at sea level? Let me know. So yeah, so I'm getting different ones, 768, I'm hearing 800, but it's a lot. So the point is that I say that this piece of equipment has so much pressure, and it's not airtight. In fact, it's made not to be airtight. That this is actually giving you a very, very good, it's giving you a very valid reference of what the pressure is outside, and at the same time, it keeps it from jumping around. Okay? And that's a picture of me just sort of putting that out there. So, oh yeah, PSI, great. Okay, so question, do you have holes drilled to normalize pressure to the outside? Sounds interesting. No, Martin, I do not have holes drilled to the outside. Basically, you'll see that the top here is very loose, that I have another tube that's stuck in here, and then that actually slides through the tube to make it easier for me to connect to it, and the top doesn't connect tightly. However, I have not perforated this particular cylinder because I didn't, here in Chicago, we oftentimes test in the snow, in the wet snow. We often test where it's sort of rainy or whatever, and I made this so that it didn't get water into it, because the last thing I want is this thing getting saturated with water and then the actual hose filling up with water. Then that becomes a problem, not a solution. Running out of time, so I want to talk about getting your baseline adjusted. So here you see I have a gauge DM32, and the DM32 says right here that the pascals with that this is 0.3 pascals with 0.02 baseline. So the baseline's been adjusted. So I guess the question is, how did it get here? So it's pretty simple. In the gauge, this is one of the few times most of the DM32 is icon driven. That means that if I want to change the device, I just look at the device and I press on it and it's pressure, so that you can do it with gloves on or you can do it with a pen or whatever, but it's pressure sensitive, so I push on this and then I look at for the icon that I want. However, this is one of the few that actually is menu driven. So I push here, I push on settings, and that takes me to this next screen. The first screen of settings, you see right at the top is baseline. So when I started, it said that there was no baseline taken. So I need to take a baseline. So I'm going to, again, just go ahead and push this one right here. I click on that. And then it asks me if I want to acquire a baseline, saying that it has no baseline. If I had a baseline from before, but I wanted to reset it, I just push clear baseline and it'll give me 0. But otherwise, if I want to get my baseline set, I push on capture baseline, and then it will run for whatever duration. So what I like to do is right now, now that I have the house set up for the shell, and I have the tubing set up, and I've got my gauge, and I'm starting to set up. This is usually when I would go and drill any holes that I had to drill, or I would go and make sure that, and of course at this time we want to make sure that all the fans are turned off. Now we're trying to get a baseline before we turn anything on, before we start going through the internal setup, so I should make that clear. But if I had anything else that I needed to do, maybe catch up on paperwork, any of those little things, this was a great time to go and do those things, so I could let this guy run a nice, long, really steady baseline. And once you're done, once you've got that baseline, you just hit in capture, and then it's going to show your baseline, and then we just use this power or home button, or you can use the back button to get back to your main screen, and then you're back here. Make sense, everybody? Okay, so stick with me. I think we've got about 5 more minutes. I've probably got a few more slides, and I'll, as always, I guess we'll go over a little bit, but I hope that if you want to stick around, you can. So let's talk about how to keep from running up and down the stairs. Here's your guy, Jay West. You can see that I am a little gassed and a little bit less than enthusiastic about the fact that I have to go back up these stairs again. So what you can do is you can actually use GaugeRemote. So GaugeRemote is a free app, and I'll give you a little bit more specifics about that in the next slide. But what it is it's a free app from Retrotec. And it essentially allows this Wi-Fi gauge, and you'll see that this is a Wi-Fi gauge. It's got the Wi-Fi symbol on it. Now, these gauges are not, a DM32, a standard gauge, is Wi-Fi ready. Internally Wi-Fi ready, does not have some sort of external antenna or anything like that. It's built in, but it is an upgrade to get it set up. So you can do it at any time. You can buy it. You can buy it without Wi-Fi, as they all were originally bought, and then update it later if you like, or update it before you buy it. But here you have, and I should have made a note here that this is from Paul Raymer. That's Paul Raymer's phone. Hey, Paul. So here we have basically the idea that these can connect. That you can connect a mobile device using GaugeRemote directly to your gauge, and no longer have to sort of run up the stairs to change something, run back down the stairs to take a note of the pressure, run up the stairs or run down the stairs. It makes it really, really easy. And John Cross says that it works great. I'm awesome. I'm glad to hear that, John. Thank you so much. So let me give you a little bit more information about the GaugeRemote app, what it does, where to get it, and how it works. Very simple. So GaugeRemote app is available for Android or iOS. It is not available for Windows Phone. If you have a Windows Phone or if you have a BlackBerry out there, yeah, you have a it's tough. It's tough out there for guys like you. I know it's, and I'm apologize. You are definitely an underserved community. But if you have an Android device of any kind, that would be a tablet, a phone, any kind of Android device or iOS device, Apple basically, you can download this. You can go right to the Google Play Store to download GaugeRemote, or the iOS, the Apple Store, the iTunes Store, and download this app. And again, it is a free app, and if you forget where to find it, you can just go to Retrotec.com, you can go to our software page, and it'll link you from there. So simple as that. You download it to your gauge, and then you're pretty much ready to go as far as getting connected to your gauge. But this is a Wi-Fi gauge, and I want to make sure that you understand this too. So the question always comes up, and that's the reason why I put this in here. So I want to make sure that you understand that Wi-Fi, so Wi-Fi gauge, is not the same thing as the internet. The internet, obviously, or having internet accessibility, it can be very spotty for most people working in homes throughout the entire United States. In fact, anywhere, most of the basements that I've been in Chicago when I've worked here, and this, of course, is the third largest city in the richest country in the world, still have problems with connectivity to the internet. However, Wi-Fi is basically a signal that a device uses to connect you to a network. It's kind of like Bluetooth, but better, without all the blues or the tooths. So I want to make sure that you understand that these do not necessarily go together. So the Wi-Fi gauge does not have an internet connection in and of itself. And if you have problems with internet connectivity, that does not mean that you can't use the Wi-Fi gauge. And there's two basic ways that you can use that Wi-Fi gauge. One is to just generate the Wi-Fi or create the Wi-Fi from the gauge. Simple. It's once again, it's just in the settings menu. You go in there, you push the button until you get to this page, the network settings, and then you click on status until you get to Wi-Fi create. And essentially, it will create its own direct communication to a device. So what it does is it creates a Wi-Fi network, so you'll get onto your mobile device, you'll go into your networks, and then you'll choose to connect to that network. Then you open up the GaugeRemote app, and voila, you are ready to go. So you do not need a router or a hotspot for this. However, I prefer to use the Wi-Fi. I prefer to use a hotspot. So you can use a router if you like. I have a couple of old ones that I don't use anymore that I take into the field with me. I simply plug them into power, and then it generates a network. And once again, that network is not connected to the internet. However, when I do that, then I can join multiple devices, and I have a really nice, strong, solid signal. So you could also make a hotspot with your phone. And that phone will actually, your phone, if you have a phone that does that, or a mobile hotspot, either one of these will actually create a network within a house. There are also some really tiny little guys that you can use that are very easy to use, and you can just get to the work site, plug them in, get a little bit more robust connection, signal, or a network, and then go right into these settings again, and then this one, click through right here on status until you get Wi-Fi join. Then once you get Wi-Fi join, to join the network, you click here. So very simple, very easy to do, and now you can join, especially if you have your laptop connected, you can join multiple gauges to your laptop. GaugeRemote will only handle one gauge at a time, but it is solely beneficial, especially if you are doing a lot of up and down, walking up and down, and help you to work a little bit smarter using technology. So simple. I think you've probably got the idea, but basically this is how it works out. So now that you've got this, you've got your GaugeRemote on your phone or mobile device connected to your gauge, and if your gauge is sort of located in the CAZ or located at the blower door, as I had suggested before, now no matter where you're at, looking for issues that you may have discovered, or just opening and closing doors to find out what the worst case depressurization is. No matter what, you no longer have to say open up a door and then walk down the stairs to look at your gauge and say, yep, that's worst case, or nope, that's not, I got to go back up and close that door. So basically what you can do now, and again, that's just an example, but the point is that when you're doing worst case depressurization for a CAZ test, inevitably you're going to end up going back and forth to look at the gauge to see what the results are. And in this instance, you do not need to do that, because now you're working smarter with technology. I didn't make that up. So kind of last thing I want to say is, how about let's talk about, well, if you guys are okay with it, I'll give you a couple more slides and then we'll take any closing questions and say goodnight. Screen capture. So, okay, well, we all know, no matter if you're working weatherization or if you're working as a HERS rater, or no matter what, we are essentially gathering information when we are testing. No matter what test you're doing, even if you're a researcher, no matter what, the information from that test is almost always intended to be communicated to someone or something. And of course, that usually falls into the realm of a report. So one of the great things that you can do, that's another best practice, it's very easy for your report, is just take a screen cap. So now if you're using, say you're using, and I think this is an iOS device, and I've got the conclusion of what my worst case depressurization is, and it's important to communicate to people what that is, I can just easily take sort of, use however you do it with your phone, do a screen capture and save that, for even email it or text it if you like, for my report. Next thing that you can do is actually you can use virtual gauge. Virtual gauge is different from GaugeRemote, and virtual gauge is different from GaugeRemote because virtual gauge actually lives on a PC. It does not live, and that's me back at home there providing some support, but it lives on your PC. Now, if your PC is connected to a network that has an internet connection, now you can do stuff like you can actually connect to that gauge or to that PC, and therefore connect to that gauge from anywhere in the world via the internet. You can provide QC oversight or even training support. Here's a real quick idea of when I was with a weatherization department in CETA. We used to do this, and here's a nice little thing that Joe put together, my partner Joe Medosh, and this is basically a how-to. So you'll see this this website right here. You'll find here's a link for how to use. It's a white paper, and that's one you see here. But basically what it is, it's how to use Hangouts on Google or Skype, which are both free, to do a screen share, and which can allow you to do QCI support, both for the gauge as well as for the person, for free, to any place that has, again, now you have to have an internet connection. So that is it for us. Thank you so much for sticking around. Looks like we pretty much maintained everybody that was here. Are there any questions? Anybody have any additional insights or anything else they want to talk about? Okay, Mo Sarifi, you've got one question. So Mo had asked earlier, and Mo asked, let me know if it's a different question. He had asked earlier, answer this again. So when do we do worst case depressurization, correct? So worst case depressurization for the BPI 1200 is going to happen after you set up the house, and after you set up your gauge, then you're ready to actually start your worst case depressurization. And that will include opening and closing doors that we discussed before, turning on exhaust and air handler, and then checking to see if the CAZ door makes a more negative or more positive or less negative effect on the combustion zone. So essentially we go through this sort of strategic process of configuring the inside of the house. We figure out at what configuration creates the worst case depressurization in the in the CAZ zone, and then depending on your standard, you either run your draft tests, your carbon monoxide tests, your whatever battery or suite of tests that you're running. With the BPI 1200, we do our combustion safety. We do our test for CO as well as for spillage. So next question, testing of combustion appliance located outside the home, like a domestic hot water in a little covered closet or in the back of a home. What CAZ testing should be performed? So if the combustion zone is outside of the thermal boundary, that is not included in most testing standards. In fact, you'll see at the top of the standard, let me read, I'm going to read from the BPI 1200. It says vented appliances, it says the following combustion appliance safety inspection must be completed to determine if fossil fuel fired appliances are operating safely under depressurized conditions. Then it says ambient CO must be monitored at all time below. So it says that vented appliances refer to natural drafted appliances equipped with barometric draft regulator or category 1 appliances equipped with draft hood or connected to a natural drafting vent system. So that's the best I can tell you as far as how to approach combustion safety or combustion appliance zones outside of the thermal boundary. So the setup of both reference A and B to the outside. What is the difference between setting both references to the outside versus just setting one reference to the outside? Okay, great question, Mo. There isn't a big difference. So if you're using a DG700, I'm not sure if you can actually, I think you can still do Pascal on the channel B. With the DM32, you can definitely get a Pascal. You can definitely read pressure in pascals on both channels. So the point is that oftentimes the way that we train people is to always think of pressure on the left and flow on the right. However, both gauges will actually be able to give you a pretty good answer no matter what. However, Mo, especially if you're instructing people how to set up the blower door and the CAZ test simultaneously, then you want to definitely tell them just to stick with channel A for pressure, because that's going to be pressure and also in pascals no matter what test you're doing. All right, well, thanks everybody. Again, greatly appreciate it. For those of you who tune in, we're a little bit behind on getting the CEUs in. It's been extremely busy for both Joe and I, but we're going to be taking care of that this week. And once again, we're really thankful for your time, and I hope, really genuinely hope that it was worth your time and that you really appreciate it. And we will see you next week for our cloud. Bye-bye.